Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Los Rios Virtual Equity Town Hall meeting. I'm Brian King, Chancellor for the Los Rios Colleges, and I want to personally thank each of you for your hard work in ensuring that our first week of classes went smoothly for our students. Last Friday at Convocation, I talked about our shared commitment to improving outcomes for all of our students, with an emphasis on Black and Latinx students. Sadly, the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin was yet another reminder of the urgency of our work together. Last week, as a part of Convocation, our 4 college presidents and I talked about the importance of working together to establish ambitious targets to put our values and statements into action. This morning, our presidents will share how much stronger we are when we work together across the 4 Los Rios colleges. We are fortunate to have a wonderful group of presidents who work together as a team. President Michael Gutierrez, president of Sacramento City College, will be the first of our 4 presidents to share an overview on behalf of the presidents. Good morning, Michael.
Thank you, Chancellor King. Back in May, the entire nation responded to the murder of George Floyd, calling for action. This week, we were reminded we have a long way to go. We must remain diligent and accountable for our anti-racism work. We must answer the call to become active participants. President Green will cover the 2 goals that the 4 presidents have agreed upon to measure our success as a district. President Green.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, President Gutierrez. So as President Gutierrez mentioned, it's in recognition, it's important for us to measure our commitments. That's part of holding ourselves accountable. And so with that recognition, but also in tandem with the shared interest in focusing, engaging the collective impact of our strategies or those actions that President Gutierrez mentioned, the 4 college presidents came together with other members of the Chancellor's executive staff, and we looked to literature to find leading indicators associated with overall student achievement and markers that help us predict transfer and degree attainment. So we ended up selecting 2 such indicators that we agreed to utilize collaboratively across our district to measure the leading impact of our actions and our strategies. So as you heard at Convocation, I'm sure these are course success and completion of transfer level English and math within the first year. So once these were identified, these metrics were shared at a special meeting with the Academic Senate presidents, a Chancellor's cabinet in a special summer session, and then they were also presented to and received support for their use from our Board of Trustees. So now President Yamamura will describe in more detail each of these metrics and leading indicators. President Yamamura.
Thank you, President Green. So the literature does show that by increasing course success rates and successful completion of transfer level English math in the first year, that leads to a path of greater increases in graduations and transfers. Obviously, in terms of course success, that means learning an A, B, or C in a class. And for each class they take, class after class, semester after semester, they will steadily make markers on the progress to getting their degree or certificate or transferring to their university to earn their bachelor's. Our objective is to eliminate the equity gap for course success rates for first-time students. There's no reason why our Black, African American, Latinx, or other disproportionately impacted groups should earn A, B's, or C's at lower rates than any other student. And we recognize that the largest gap we must close is with our Black and African American students. Second, we seek to eliminate the equity gap for first-time students enrolling in and successfully completing transfer level English and math classes in their first year of college. Again, the research shows that taking transfer level English and math and not postponing it dramatically increases the rates that students succeed in earning their degrees and certificates and transferring to a university. Enrolling and successfully completing English level math and transfer level English and math is called throughput. We want to increase the throughput for our students and eliminate the equity gap. As the catalyst for social mobility and the great democratizing engine, we have a duty to give all of our students an equal ability to succeed. We must eliminate the equity gap for our students. Brian?
President Ed Bush is in Washington, D.C., participating in a celebration of the anniversary of Martin Luther King's historic speech. He has been attempting to reach us, but the technology is a little shaky. So President Michael Gutierrez is going to share the remarks from President Bush. Michael?
I think those were covered already, Brian, with our other remarks. We were able to fill in for President Bush during our remarks.
All right. Well, just an explanation of where Ed is. He's representing us well in our nation's capital. So our two friends, sometimes we refer to them as our critical friends who are going to help us in this work, are Lasana Hotep and Cynthia Olivo. I am not going to provide a detailed introduction of them, though they deserve it, because part of their presentation will be to introduce themselves to us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lasana and Cynthia.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to immediately turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Olivo, where she will do her introductions, and then I will follow with my introductions. But I just want to let you all know that we're honored, happy, and excited about this morning and about this work that we will be engaging in with the Los Rios community.
Thank you so much. It's an honor for us to be here with you as your friends, your critical friends. I just want to give you a little background about myself. It is, amazing to be here today also on the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington. And one of my favorite lines in the speech, I Have a Dream by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is the fierce urgency of now. And I want to echo what was already mentioned, that it is so important that all of us address this work with a sense of urgency. Our students are relying upon us to do whatever it is we can to make things better. And so this is my 25th year in higher ed. I worked for 13 years at Cal State University, San Bernardino, and this is my 12th year at Pasadena City College. I have a background as an activist, a community organizer, a scholar, and practitioner. And I do see my work, as political. I think the work of an educator is political. I have a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in counseling, and my PhD is in urban education from Claremont Graduate University. I'm third generation born in the United States of America and first in my family to go to college. My current role is Assistant Superintendent, Vice President of Student Services. I just finished my term as the President of the Chief Student Services Officer Association, and I am now the President of a new organization in our state called Colegas. And Colegas is the Spanish word for colleague, although it also means family member, friend, someone I trust to work with and, get good work done. I'm also an adjunct faculty at the Rossier College of Education at USC, and I am a presidential fellow with the Aspen Institute. I served as a faculty member for the assessment of general education outcomes this summer with the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And I'm currently a member of the Jobs for the Future Leadership and Policy Trust, and you can check out our blog that we release monthly on LinkedIn. Thank you very much. I look forward to working with all of you on racial equity. And, part of the reason why I was asked to work with you all is because I've led Pasadena City College in this type of work for the past 4 to 5 years. And I contracted Estela Ben Simon and the Center for Urban Education to come in and work with us for a 2-year period. And this is where we kind of catapulted into focusing specifically on racial equity. And we've seen results from that work. And so I look forward to engaging in that with all of you.
And so it's my honor and pleasure to share a little bit about my background as well. And we think that it's very important that we share portions of our story in this initial stages, so you can kind of get an idea of our lens, our experiences, and how they are going to be leveraged and how they add value to the overall work that we're doing collectively as a family. And so I am a native of Los Angeles, California. And normally when I say I'm from LA, people be like, well, where? Because a lot of people are from like suburbs, but I'm from like LA, like Manchester, Vermont, LA Rebellion. When you saw on TV it was burning, that's the LA I am from. I was born in Los Angeles at Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Hospital, the official hospital of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. I love to say that because it's just such a weird thing. And and I was raised in LA at the height of gang violence and the crack epidemic that plagued the inner cities of America. And through a lot of blessings and a lot of family nurturing, I was able to survive that environment as an African-American man from a family of two parents. My father never graduated from high school, and my mother has a high school education. And so right when I was about to finish high school, my mother decided to get us out of California and move me to Texas. So I started my collegiate journey in Texas at a college that at the time was called Southwest Texas State University, which is now called Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. And at Texas State University, I was more of an activist than I was necessarily a student. I was more of an activist student than a student activist. I ended up presiding over 3 different organizations while at the institution. One of those organizations was a Black Studies organization that we created. We had no cultural studies, we had no ethnic studies, we had no African American studies. So on Wednesday nights, me and a collective of my peers would teach ourselves about our history, our culture, the politics of Black people, and then organize around those types of things. Academically, I double majored in speech communications with an emphasis on rhetorical criticism and history, and with the emphasis on post-war America. After leaving Texas State University and graduating, I initially went into my first career, which was in television news of all careers, but that's a whole nother story. And but at the same time, while I was in television news, I went into an entrepreneurial endeavor with one of my fraternity brothers. That whole time I was still working with colleges and universities because they really wanted me to work with their multicultural student centers and work with their African-American and Latinx male programs because I had a reputation as a college student for working with those populations. And so eventually I got an offer from Arizona State University to come and develop a program called AMASU, the African American Men of Arizona State University. This initiative was based off of a program called the Hispanic Mother-Daughter Program that had been developed 20 years prior to me coming to Arizona State University. And the concept was very simple. It was to partner with families within the community and go in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders and have the student and the family members come on campus for college readiness workshops to open up the pipeline to the university, but also prepare the family for college readiness as a unit. And so we studied the Hispanic Mother-Daughter program. I worked intimately with that program to learn the nuts and bolts of it and applied a lot of those principles to the program for African-American males, and also had a retention component for African-American males that were already on campus. If you want to know more about that program, Dr. Michael Shuye wrote a book called African American Men of Colleges, African American Men in College. He edited this book, and it's a chapter about the program in this book as a case study. I worked in the Multicultural Student Center, and I was over all African American programming at the 4 campuses of Arizona State University. At the time, it had about 74,000 students, and about 5% were African American. And I ran everything from their early engagement programs or their summer programs focused on cultural communities, all the way to the African American convocation and anything in between. I advised the Black Greek letter organizations, I advised the non-Greek letter organizations, and did programming and support and retention efforts at Arizona State University in the Multicultural Student Center. After that, I went to the academic side of the house when I went to work on my graduate studies. I went to the history department and helped develop something called the Center for the study of race and democracy. And that's a picture that you see for one of the initiatives we had. Actually, that picture was taken after I had already left Arizona State University and went to the community colleges, and they invited me back to be a panelist with Edward James Olmos. But at the CSRD, we did programs like you see there, the Black and Latino Coalition Project. We did the Visionary Lecture Series. We did the Delivering Democracy Lecture. We did a Barack Obama and American Democracy Conference that we shared with Tufts University. We did a lot of programs at CSRD. Once I helped developing the CSRD, I wanted to explore community colleges. And so I began my foray into community colleges in a college called Estrella Mountain Community College, where I was the first director of multicultural affairs. And I developed a program called LINK, which is Learners Invested in Networking and Knowledge. And LINK was focusing on first generation, low income and non-traditional students, primarily African-American, Latinx, but from other cultural groups, to deal with their issues of persistence and retention for those groups. And so this LINK program worked collectively with a variety of campus partners. And our first cohort retained at a 96% rate, second cohort at 96% rate. But the most revealing thing was that they had pretty high GPAs. We weren't expecting the average GPA, the first cohort to be 3.3 and the next one to be 2.94. So as the director of multicultural affairs and at Estrella Mountain, we were able to build that out. Loved the work I was doing there, loved being in Arizona, but I wanted to get back to my home state of California. Wasn't much activity going on in Southern California, so I ended up in the Bay, and I ended up at Merritt College. At Merritt College, I served in 2 different capacities. First, I went there initially as the director of student activities, where I oversaw all activities in terms of student life. And then I eventually became the dean of what they call the dean of special programs and grants, but in essence, it's the dean of students. So I had, in partnership with the VPSS, I had A&R, financial aid, veterans, foster youth, orientation, all those things in my portfolio. And so I was operating at a dean's level. The chancellor at the time, Jose Ortiz, wanted to do an initiative focusing on students of color. And so he asked me to come to the chancellor's office and serve as the assistant vice chancellor of equity, where I oversaw all equity initiatives over the 4 Peralta campuses. We had a change in chancellors, and the change in leadership had a different vision for where they wanted equity to go. So that's when I accepted a position at Skyline College as the inaugural Dean of Student Equity and Support Programs, where I developed the Equity Training Series, the Call to Conscious Lecture Series, and a variety of other initiatives that led to us developing something called the Equity Institute, where I was the founding executive director of the Equity Institute, where we developed academies and brought teams of people from throughout the state of California and prepared them for equity work through a variety of frameworks we developed. I currently serve as the director of equity, inclusion, and belonging at the University of California at Berkeley, and I have my consulting company, Hotep Consultants. And so that kind of gives you background, an abbreviated, truncated version of my journey. But I wanted you to understand that this is not a situation where you're dealing with people who are fly-by-nights, Johnny-come-latelys. We've been doing this work at the intersection of culture and identity and student success for a significant amount of time, and it's a part of what we do. So what we wanted to cover today in the town hall was just some baseline things, right? As we begin to work with the district as a whole, but each individual college within the district and various stakeholders throughout the college and the district, we want to make sure that we have some common understandings. One of the most important things that we can do in this work is understand what we mean when we say certain things. And so we have this word called equity, and this is even called the equity town hall. And right now, equity is being used as a synonym for a variety of things. People are using equity as a synonym for diversity. People are using equity as a synonym for people of color. People are just using equity as an umbrella term, right? And so one of the things that Cynthia and I would like to do today is just address this whole issue of what equity is. So we can be very clear when we say equity, what do we mean? And I want to also emphasize this about equity. If you look at this picture, other than not passing the snuff on any HGTV program, no matter who the host is, as a horrible paint job, what it represents is what a lot of our equity efforts look like nowadays, right? We think that we can slap some equity on all the things that we've been doing before and have different outcomes, right? We don't want to do the prime work that we have to do. We don't want to have to remove the old paint. We don't want to have to interrogate the narratives that we've been operating off of. We don't want to have to interrogate any biases. We just want to think we can just have people come in, slap some equity on all of the inequity, all of the racial injustice, all of the other stuff, and have it come out whole. And that's one of the biggest issues that we're having, is that we're going to have to do some work of unlearning, right? Most times people come in and I've been a consultant for over 20 years, and they want me to tell them, what should I do? I don't tell people what to do. The first thing I start telling them what they need to stop doing. Right? Because you have to understand that what you're doing is creating the status quo, and the status quo is creating the inequity. Right? So that you have to understand. So we have to say, what is it about the status quo? What is it about what we are doing that we have to rethink and reimagine? And so one of the leaders in this work, even before it was called equity work, is Dr. Pedro Nogueira, who's now the dean of the School of Education at University of Southern California. And I like to share a clip that he has in the TED Talk when I have these kinds of conversations with communities, because he kind of gives us an idea of the framing. We're really focused on closing gaps in this work, but he challenges us in another level. So let's watch this clip together, and then we'll continue to build on this conversation.
We have made this much more difficult than it should be. And much of the problem lies not in the children, because we have lots of evidence that we know how to educate all types of children, children with disabilities, children with all kinds of challenges. The problem is the way we treat the children. The problem is the kinds of schools we've created, and more importantly, the kinds of policies we've relied upon to drive education in this country. And we have lots and lots of evidence that what we've been doing as a nation isn't working. We have the international comparisons that show we keep falling further and further behind. Last time we checked, we were behind Slovenia, which really got the Congress mad because most of them didn't know Slovenia was a country. We have dropout rates of 50% and higher in almost every major city, with a policy called No Child Left Behind, clearly leaving many, many children behind. And so as I think about it, what's wrong is that we have relied on the wrong kinds of questions to drive our policy. We've been asking how to raise achievement when what we should be asking is how to get kids excited about learning. We've been asking how do we hold teachers accountable when what we should be asking is how do we hold everyone accountable? Parents, students, politicians, everyone accountable for educating our children. And we've been focused on closing the achievement gap and asking what it'll take to close the gap. And what we should be asking is, how do we create schools where a child's race or class does not predict how well they will do? If you ask different questions, you come out with different answers. But
how do we create schools where a student's race or class does not predict how well they will do? That question, with that as the North Star, right? That particular driving inquiry, right, really addresses a lot of things that we're trying to achieve and that we're trying to accomplish. But before we can even start talking about race and class and its impact, we have to embrace something. We have to embrace this paradigm shift, and everybody within our colleges have to be on the same page about this, okay? And a lot of the conversations immediately start talking about what we see in our C program equity report, or any individual research that we've done at our institutions that's independent of anything that was requested out of Sacramento. And we immediately start to zone in on the populations that are disproportionately impacted. And I understand, but before the institution can do that, we have to understand why we're doing that. And so I want to address a little bit about the why before I hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Olivo. So back in the olden days, before you could stream movies on your home TV, before we all had computers in our pockets, and before artificial intelligent bots gave out tweets, you would go to the first day of your institution, and it would be some kind of assembly like this, where the president or the provost or the dean of students would come before the first class, and they would say something like this: look to your left and look to your right. One of you will not be here at graduation. And some of us still do this. Some faculty, they come to class and they say on the first day, I only give 2 A's a year. And if you're one of the hardworking, lucky souls, you may get one of those A's, right? We say these things to express that college isn't for everyone. Right? We say these things to let people know that this is a rigorous institution and you might not make it. And that's the error. But you have to understand that not only is that the error that we come from, everything within our colleges has been built around this model. The organization chart, the labor contracts, the way in which we fund our organization, everything is around this model of look to your left, look to your right, one of you won't be here, right? But we're no longer in this era. And as the college presidents clearly pointed out, we're in the student success era. And the college presidents clearly said, we're looking at course completion. We're looking at retention and persistence. We're looking at completion of degrees and certificates and transfer. We're looking at who's completing transfer level math and English. This is a different era. Now you would say something like, look to your left, look to your right. Those are the people you're going to need to help you get across the finish line. But our colleges have not had this candid conversation. And the candid conversation is this: what does my job, whatever your job is within the institution, look like in this era? Versus what my job looked like in what we call the right to fail era. Because the notion of right to fail was that post-secondary education isn't compulsory. So you're volunteering to come here. And if you're successful, that's fine. If you're not, that's fine. You have a right to fail. And everything's been built around that. Everything's been built around the 45th class day. We're not saying we're malicious, nefarious people who didn't care about what happened to you on the 46th class day, but we really, 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 really cared about what happened up to the 45th class day, right? Because that's where we submit our data and that's where we got our apportionment. And that's what our organizations have been built around. And the frank, candid conversation, before we can even talk about cultural identity, anti-racism and all, is what does my job in financial aid? What is my job in A&R? What is my job in student life? What is my job as a classroom instructor? What is my job as a counselor? What about it makes it different in the completion agenda era than when it was in the right to fail era? That's the initial conversation we need to have as a district, as a college, as a department, as a division. Does our jobs look differently? And many of us would say no. I beg to differ, but many people would say no, but we have to interrogate that, right? Is it just about giving somebody their financial aid award? And being in the completion agenda era, we ask different questions. In the olden days, we asked the question, how can we make more college-ready students? And we look at the communities and the families that students come from. We look at the P-12 pipeline that produced these students, and we will look at the students themselves. But in the student success era, we are asking a different question. How do we become student-ready colleges? What does it mean for me within the organization to be student-ready? The authors of the book, Becoming a Student-Ready College, says, being student-ready requires more than a mission or diversity statement. At student-ready colleges, everyone from admissions to the business office, to the classroom, and even campus security are intentionally designed to facilitate students' progressive advancement towards college completion and positive post-college outcomes. This is a different orientation towards education. Before we can even start talking about why race, identity, and culture matters within education, we have to come to terms. We are no longer in the right to fail era. We are in the student success era. And the student success era requires us to become student ready. And to be student ready, you have to be culturally competent, because the students who are coming to our colleges are from a variety of different backgrounds. This is why we're doing it, not just because the data says this group is disproportionately impacted, which takes us to this conversation about equity. Now, many of us might be able to relate to this scenario. In this particular picture, you see a line for the restroom in a public space. And the one that says ladies, there's a long line. And one that says men, not only is there not a line, this guy's just sauntering out, putting his shades on, about to go back to the beach. What you're looking at, what you're seeing is equality. This is equal. This is one for men, one for women. But even in the equality, you see one group disproportionately impacted. One group unnecessarily burdened by equality. Now, what we've done in education, instead of looking at it, as we can clearly see with this illustration, that it's a structural issue, that we either need more facilities or more stalls or something like that, that the structure is what needs to be critiqued. What we do is we critique the people who are in the line. We critique the people who are disproportionately impacted. We say, what is it about women? Why does it take them so long to use the restroom? Right? We have to do something about the way these women are using the restroom. Can we get a learning community around women and using the restroom? And can we give them polos, give them an advisor, give them some money for pizza? Maybe somebody should do some graduate research on it. Let's get some masters and doctoral dissertations about women who can potty. And then we'll find the women who can use the restroom real fast, and we'll take them to conferences, put them on panels, and they'll shame the other women who can't use the restroom as fast. They'll say, why can't you use the restroom? Caitlin can use it, Keisha, she can potty fast. What's wrong with you? Why can't you go? Because that's what we do with students. We find those who are successful despite the structural barriers, and we parade them around in male success clubs and organizations, put them in suits and ties or give them some nice polos, and they go around. Keyshawn can do it, why can't you do it? Right? And this is what we do, but this is equality, right? Equality looks like this. Equity might look something like this in what I call potty parity, or it could even look something like this where we have non-gender conforming restrooms. But this is the reason why we cannot have equity in our organizations. It's because as soon as the group that's disproportionately impacted clearly needs more resources that comes from the institutional level, because we identify that as structural, not necessarily in the people themselves. The people who aren't disproportionately impacted are advocates for them. Let's say in this case, men would say, that's not fair. You give them another restroom, you need to give me another restroom. That's just more equality. And we already know that equality still produces disparate impact. So this argument that if you give them one, you got to give me one, keeps us from having equity in our organizations. Because one of three things happens. Either the men's argument wins out and they get an extra restroom that they don't even need, but they got to get another one because somebody else got one. So now we're burning through resources. Or we don't give anybody anything because we don't want to have to deal with this disruption. So we maintain the systemic and institutional barriers and just grin and bear it and try to figure out all these workarounds so that we won't disrupt people. Or we have courageous leadership that says, no, we're going to address inequity. And then the constituent bodies and stakeholders who don't believe in equity by action, not by words, will weaponize all of their various organizations and tools and positions to try to antagonize the people who are making an equity move. And this is where we stall, right? And so I use this analogy as far as potty parity to kind of illustrate to you all where we are. When we start talking about educational equity, it's different than equality. Equality is good. And in this next group of slides, Dr. Olivo is going to talk about the difference between equity and equality. But I just want to give you just some very basic understanding. Equality is good. Everybody should have access to the library. Everyone should have access to tutoring. Everyone should have access to quality instruction. That's good. It's not bad, right? Equality is when everyone is treated the same. But equity is achieved when what? Students receive the resources they need graduating prepared for success. That's a different thing. And sometimes it might not look like that it's fair, right? But you have to understand that the status quo that has produced the inequities weren't fair in the first place to the people who are disproportionately impacted for the decades that they had to endure this inequity. That wasn't fair to them, right? And so at this point, I'm gonna turn the conversation over to my colleague, Dr. Olivo, who's gonna talk to us about this framework of equity and equality developed by the Center for Urban Education.
Thank you so much, Lasana. And so as Lasana mentioned, it's extremely important that we all get on the same page about our vocabulary and a common understanding so that we can work from that viewpoint towards what your district is asking of us, right? To have a fierce urgency about working towards racial equity. And so, you know, the Center for Urban Education has amazing resources on their webpage. This happens to come from the contract that I mentioned earlier that Pasadena City College engaged with. This helped us to understand the notion of equality, right? I care about all students equally. And in the work that we engaged in, a lot of faculty, classified staff, managers said this. You know, I was raised with a golden rule. You treat everybody the same. But we have to understand that this notion of equality, imagining an equal world, is not really the case for many of us and for many of our students. And I heard you all say this morning, you're focusing on Black and Latinx students. And, you know, we have to remember that the world isn't equal for our students, especially from these two communities. And I can share my personal story. You know, my great-grandparents migrated from Mexico to Kansas, and they helped build the railroad. And that was in the 1920s. They faced a lot of discrimination back then because they were trying to preserve their culture in this small town in Kansas. And I wanted to mention that, you know, from the 1920s through 3 generations that my family's been here, we've faced systemic barriers towards education. And so we have to remember the world is not equal, right? We have poorly funded schools, we have less skilled teachers, counselor ratios where our students are trying to get in to see somebody to help them, and there's 1,000 students per counselor, a curriculum that's not addressing their unique backgrounds that they can identify with. And so that systemic racism, right, the systemic barriers that are in place that our students have to navigate around, it makes it extremely difficult. And so, Lasana, if you can move to the next slide. That systemic bias and racism of, you know, that our students face, we have to figure out how we can make it very explicit and address it through our practices. And I really have seen when people care about something, they come together and intentionally address it, we can change it. And that's what we are asking you all to do. And so we have to remember, we've been in an era of diversity. Diversity focuses on bringing more students into an unequal pathway. It's just, let's make it more, you know, inclusive, but not do anything to change the structure. And we are asking for a new way, right? Equity redirects resources to the pathways with the greatest need to fix barriers and intentionally provide support. So it's recognizing that there is a systemic barrier and that things are not equal, that we have to focus and shift our resources, change our practices so that we can direct our attention to the students that need it the most. That's equity. And being an equity-minded practitioner, is understanding that our work requires us to take responsibility at the individual level and the institutional level. It's to understand that education has a social and historical context. And what I was mentioning in my family, right, from the 1920s to 2000 to 2020, you know, in the 1930s, my grandparents faced mass deportation, segregation of school. In the 1940s, my aunts and uncles got punished for speaking Spanish in school. In the 50s, you know, my mom her name was Juanita. They called her Jenny. She was called, you know, derogatory names about race to her face by her peers. You know, there were communities that didn't follow Brown versus Board of Education until the 1970s in Southern California. So it's understanding as an educator that you are aware of the social and historical context of education and how higher ed, K-12 ed was all designed to basically transmit expectations about race and culture. And so you take responsibility for your practices and changing those practices from exclusion to inclusion. Lafana, you want to mention more about equity-mindedness?
The one thing I want to say about equity-mindedness is this, and I want to go back to this particular slide because I want to say it louder for the people in the Zoom room in the back, is that when we say equity, we're not using it as a synonym, right, for diversity. We're not using it as a synonym for URM or underrepresented minority. When we say equity, we're talking about redirecting resources to pathways with the greatest need. So that's why we, as your critical friends, have been brought in to work specifically with particular communities. But you have to understand that there's a reason why. It's because we're recognizing that the issue is systemic, institutional, and there are things that we can do on our end in the student success era. And so I wanted us to be clear. So when we're working within our institutions and we're using equity, we all have a shared definition of where we're going with that, and that it does take us taking personal and institutional responsibility. And when we say we take personal and institutional responsibility, we're not saying we don't have any agency for the students. The students have agency. They have to show up, they have to engage the material, they have to take the test, they have to write the papers. But what we're saying is that for us to actually meet the students, when we say we meet them where they are or meet them halfway, we have to at least do the interrogation of our practices and say, are we creating any barriers? The question has to be asked, and it has to be explored, it has to be investigated, right? And that's what we're seeing in this era of equity.
Yeah, and pictured here is a math faculty member from Aurora College in Colorado. And he happens to be the chair of his department at his community college. And so this is James Gray. James participated in equity professional development and this call to action, just like all of you are going to be engaging in. And it was after his participation that he realized he was directly responsible through his practices as a chair for producing racial inequities in student outcomes. And he said, you know, when he focused on how he was socialized around race, he realized it did have an impact on his decision-making, on his practices as a teacher, as an administrator, and as a leader in higher education. And he coined this term. He said, you know, it's not about students being first-generation college students. It's really about us first-generation equity workers. He said, I have no one to go home to and talk about race, because race and racism, you know, experiencing it anyways, was not a part of how he grew up. And so he did say, you know, it requires a lot of interpersonal interrogation of your own thoughts and feelings. And then you have to figure out, how does it connect to your actions? And so it's just incredible to see what James and the faculty at Aurora College in Colorado have done to change their practices. And you should see their outcomes in math for our Black and Latinx students. They're phenomenal. So the transformation is possible. And we wanted to point out, many of you might be out there, you might be first generation equity practitioners. We're going to be on this journey together. And we are here to help you as your critical friends to learn the concepts that are necessary so that we can move forward and realize these goals that we've set for each other. So another piece of this work is to ensure that we are all following the same kind of framework, right? Having a common framework, common vocabulary, and a common understanding, it helps people, right, from 4 different colleges like yourselves. If we're all understanding, we're going to address this work through a lens that is evidence-based, race-conscious, focused on the institution, while understanding we're aware of the system and that we're going to continue advancing equity. If we focus on having this common framework, we can remain together on the same page and not lose sight of the goals that we're working towards. And so this is going to be our framework that we will work from. And we will make all of this available on your website so that you have an easy place to access the vocabulary as well as the framework and the concepts that we've introduced to you this morning. Another huge piece of our work is, something that we call inquiry. And you've heard Lasana already describe it as interrogation, right? It's self-reflection. It's a review of your practices. And so this is a cycle of inquiry that we introduced at my college through the work with the Center for Urban Education. So the cycle goes like this. You have an observation, right? A hunch about your work. Then you gather some evidence of racial and ethnic patterns. You do some self-reflection on that practice. Like, how am I involved in this? What is it that I'm doing that is lending towards the outcomes? You develop an idea about how to change those practices. And then you implement those changes and you measure, right? You measure the impact. And so you develop equity-mindedness through this process. And this is where it's not about simply figuring out, well, what's the best practice out there that I can pull off the shelf and plop into this college or my classroom or my department or division. This is about becoming a best practitioner where you're constantly figuring out, what is it that I can do to change? How can I do better by my students? And so this is the inquiry process that we, and Lasana and I, will implement, to help you develop new practices that lead to better racial equity for our students. I wanted to share with you that this work requires a lot of humility, right? We will probably not feel good when we see outcomes and then you are feeling personally responsible for those outcomes. You're going to want to focus on, well, we do this well, and I wanted to share, this is a part of some outcomes that we have at Pasadena City College on a survey that we administered, designed by Dr. J. Luke Wood and Dr. Frank Harris. And it's called the Community College Success Measure. The survey, it asks students a series of questions, and this part of the survey, it measures sense of belonging that our students feel from faculty, and then personal relationship with faculty. And you can see the columns here: white students, Asian students, African American, and Latino. Well, sense of belonging with faculty is acceptable, but personal relationship with faculty, you can see it says immediate concern. And so I mentioned that we need humility when we're doing this work, because you really have to put your ego aside in the work that we do in order to say, you know what, let me look into this. How can I help my students understand that I care about their career goals, that I know about them, that I know about what they're working towards in their life, right? That I know key information about their life. Are there some assignments or prompts that I can add in or change something that I'm doing the first 2 weeks of class to build rapport with students? So we use this data in our new faculty seminar and to inform our professional development goals. I'm just saying here, you know, please understand we will be looking at outcomes, and as your critical friends, we will guide you through a process of self-reflection to see how your practices are connected to these outcomes. And, you know, this is an invitation to help do something about it.
So I earlier had talked about this concept of quote unquote weaponizing equity. And I wanted to just elaborate on it before I went to our next phase, and then we're going to open it up for question and answers, which will be facilitated by Ms. Melanie Dixon. So I was part of a team. We developed something called the Equity Training Series at Skyline College. And when we developed the Equity Training Series, it's an 8-week series of workshops that participants go through where they learn about various cultural groups, and sometimes it's not culturally based, but identity groups. So we have presenters come in, talk about supporting men of color or working with Latinx students. We were in the Daly City community, so I was working on Pinoy Panay community, working with undocumented students, right? And it's like an 8-week series of dealing with all these various identities and then broader notions of equity and race and identity. And what would happen inevitably, no matter how many cohorts we've had, the project at the end of this was you're supposed to go from this experience and talk about how you're going to either implement it in your classroom instruction if you're a faculty member, or get with a team of folks and talk about how y'all going to do a project or program focusing on a disproportionately impacted group and how you're going to do that. And inevitably, in every cohort, we would have a group, right, who would say, our project is going to be on night and evening students, because night and evening students don't have the same resources and access as daytime students. Now, you just went through an 8-week series learning all about the history and culture, 3-hour immersion. Robin DeAngelo's come talk to you. Cesar Cruz has come talk to you. Frank Harris and Luke Wood has come talk to you. And you want to focus on night and evening students. There's nothing wrong with focusing on night and evening students. But what happens is that people want to avoid the racial conversation so bad that they're going to find another disproportionately impacted group to talk about other than people who have a racial identity, right? And that's where we have this issue where someone say, well, what about socioeconomic status? We're not saying that those particular students don't need to have a focus. We're not saying that veterans don't need to have a focus. We're not saying current and former foster youth. All of them need resources, all of them need support. But we have to be clear with ourselves and as an institution, are we taking these populations and putting them on the table when we start talking about race to get race off the table? Or are we talking about these populations because silly they need support, and we can have that same conversation about racialized groups? So this is what I mean about not weaponizing equity, not bringing up these other quote unquote, it's not fair, why don't they factors just to avoid talking about race. You cannot go through 8 weeks of training about race and cultural identity and end up talking about we need to have a process on night and evening students, right? Which they do need support. And that brings us to this issue of dealing with race and identity and culture. We've primarily within the United States of America as a whole, and institutions as an aggregate have gone with the diversity, equity, and inclusion and multiculturalism approach. There's nothing wrong with this approach, just like there's nothing wrong with equality. It makes all people feel equal representation based on background. It celebrates difference, but it focuses mostly on difference, not disparity, right? You will have an event and everybody will bring a dish from their community, will listen to music from different communities, but it doesn't deal with the fact, the reason why we have quote unquote gaps or why we have disparity, right? And many of us prefer this approach, right? This focus primarily on it, or we all have something to bring, because it allows us to lean on what Cynthia talked about earlier, which is this golden rule. I treat everybody the same. But I like to share this clip when I initially engaged communities, that is an excerpt from Robin DiAngelo, where she's talking specifically about this whole notion of just the golden rule and just being nice, how it maintains the status quo and how the status quo continue to disproportionately impact groups.
Into the status quo.
Lasana, the audio's not working.
It's actually quite revealing.
My
into the
apologies.
status quo. For so many white people, we think that the answer to racism is friendliness. If you notice the evidence that most white people will give for why they're not racist, one of their top pieces of evidence is, I know people of color. I have friends of color. And so if we apply that question, you know, if we look at that evidence as a way to understand the deeper structure of meaning, right, it's actually quite revealing. So in order for a claim like that, I know people of color, I have friends of color, in order for a claim like that to be good evidence of my lack of racism, a racist can't be able to do that. Otherwise, it's not good evidence, right? This is what distinguishes me from a racist. I have people of color in my life. I live in New York City. I was in Teach for America. I went to a diverse school. These are all the claims that white people will make for their lack of racism. Well, that must mean a racist cannot live in New York City, could not know or speak to or be friendly to people of color, could not be in the Peace Corps, etc. And I'm hoping you can see right now how ridiculous that evidence is, because even an avowed racist can do all of those things. So most white people believe that niceness is all it takes. And the status quo of our society is the reproduction of racial inequality. That's what it does. It's a default of all of our institutions, our norms, and our policies. It's what our society does. It's what it's always done. Our outcomes are not improving. By many measures, our outcomes of racial disparity are increasing, right? And all this system needs to keep on keeping on reproducing racial inequality with whites benefiting from it is for white people just to be really nice. Be really nice. Go ahead. Smile at your coworkers of color, go to lunch on occasion, and do nothing else. And you will uphold that system, because niceness is not courageous. Niceness is not anti-racism. Niceness will not get racism on the table, and it will not keep it on the table when everyone wants it off the table. I suppose it's better than not being nice, but it takes strategic, intentional anti-racist action. It is a lifelong process that I will never be finished from.
So what are we talking about when we say strategic anti-racist actions? Remember, I told you that's not about necessarily what we start doing, but what we undo, what we unlearn. And we have to have a reorientation about what racism is and what racism isn't. And we're going to deal with that and explore it as we do this work. But I just kind of want to give you an idea so we know what vocabulary, when we say we want to be anti-racist, what this means and what that looks like, okay? And so I want to, give me 1 second. So I want to just kind of give you an idea right now. We think racism, right, exists because people don't know each other's stories, or they don't know each other's communities, or they're not in proximity of each other. We're going to do a whole lot of programs trying to just bring people together and have a lot of storytelling and a lot of bringing different groups so that they can be in proximity. And so that this interpersonal focus is like, this is why racism exists, because interpersonally, we don't mingle enough. We're in segregated communities. And I understand that argument. But we have this phenomenon in the society called sexism. The sexism exists because men aren't in proximity to women, because men don't know women's stories. Men don't know women. We don't know our mothers, our aunts, our partners, our cousins, our colleagues. No, it exists because of exploitation. But if you have a notion that racism exists because people don't know each other, you're just going to focus on everybody getting to know each other. But even if we know each other, it doesn't deal with what? The side of exploitation. And so anti-racism and anti-sexism understand that these issues are based on exploitation, not on just difference, merely people not understanding each other. And so anti-racist, when she talks about being anti-racist, and when we talk about being anti-racist, and when Ibram Kendi talks about being anti-racist, we seek to rid the organization, the curriculum, and learning environments of all forms of racism and sexism, meaning that all forms that cater to narratives that rationalize the exploitation of groups of people. So when we say we want to be anti-racist and we're moving towards anti-racist, we're not just talking about people coming together, getting to know each other. We're talking about eliminating sites of exploitation. Now I have a colleague, his name is Dr. Jelani Cobb. He's now at Columbia University. But when this video clip was taken at this town hall meeting, he was at the University of Connecticut. And this is a town hall meeting that was held in South Carolina after Dylann Roof had went into a church and murdered 9 parishioners after their prayer meeting. And so Dr. Cobb is going to talk specifically about some of our misunderstandings about why we have racial animus, because we do not have racial animus because people use pejoratives or slurs. We do not have racial animus just because people are different. He's going to talk to us about that, and then we're going to conclude, and then we're going to open the floor up for conversation. But we have to be very clear on what racism is and isn't.
Jelani Cobb is a University of Connecticut history professor and also a prolific writer for the New Yorker magazine. And as you've listened to this unfold, what have you heard left unsaid?
First, I would say that it's very difficult to continually have this conversation. That we saw this conversation after Baltimore, we saw this conversation after Ferguson. We're having this conversation now, and no doubt there'll be some occasion for us to have this conversation again in the future.
Which breaks my heart.
It does. And I think that, with no ill intent, we've greatly overestimated 2 things. 1, the power of conversation, and 2, the extent of the benevolence of white people in America.
What do you mean?
And what I mean by that is this, that there are studies that show that more than half of white people in this country feel that they are the primary victims of racism. And that having a dialogue, slavery did not begin because of miscommunication. Jim Crow did not happen. Jim Crow did not happen because people somehow couldn't get on the same page. That these were systems that were designed to exploit one group of people to the benefit of another group of people. And unless we're willing to talk about this, these connections between what Dylann Roof saw as himself as a part of an aggrieved group of people who were besieged by Black people, which is the same thinking that animated the violent attacks on Black people in this state after Reconstruction. The white belief that Black people had something that they were not entitled to, that somehow or another that they were losing out, that the currency of whiteness had been devalued. And this is what we're talking about here. And so it is about interests. It is about who has resources. It is about who has excess resources. It is about who is willing to part with those resources.
And so I want everyone to understand that we just want to be on the same page on what we mean by equity, what we mean by investigation or interrogation, what we mean by anti-racism, just as we initially begin to do this work so you can understand some of the baseline concepts. But I consider myself an optimistic pragmatist, right? And so we're in this COVID-19 moment where we had this public health crisis. And we've seen some things take place within our organization that we could not fathom, right? We had people who had been resistant, either individuals or entire units that had been resistant to online instruction, and in a matter of weeks, take our institution online. We had certain student services functions that we really didn't know how we would take it fully online, but through ingenuity and innovation and imagination, we've been able to bring our institutions online. We've even been able to be resourceful enough to find our students who lacked technology, procure those resources, and then distribute it to them in a safe way where they can actually engage in this virtual environment. And we've even reimagined our trainings, our meetings, our opening days. If you would have told us this time last year that the Los Rios district would have had an opening week last week where it would have been virtual, no one would have believed it. So I know that our districts, that our colleges, that our divisions, our departments, our students, faculty, staff, administrators, and everyone within our organization has the ability, the capacity to change on a dime because a public health crisis let us know this, how flexible that we really can be, how much dexterity that we had that we did not have. And so I have this same optimism that we have in this COVID-19 moment, in this equity moment. But the thing that's going to be the key thing is not trying to figure out the right technique or to find out the right thing that's mechanical or tell me exactly what to do, or to try to get into a woke contest with me and Dr. Olivo to try to see what vocabulary words or what frameworks you know that we don't know, but really to use our imaginations. To really say, we used our imaginations in taking our face-to-face format with a little bit of online and turning it 100% online in a matter of weeks. And that same imagination and that same willingness to have a sense of urgency around the matter is going to be what's going to carry us into this new era of being equity-minded, to being anti-racist, and to being a fully fledged student-ready college and district. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to pause before moving into the questions and answers. You guys have been sending questions and I've been collecting them, and we will work with them. But before I move into that, I just want to thank our district, our board, and certainly Dr. Olivo and Lizana Hotep for providing this session, locking arms with us and doing this work as a collective. So I'm really excited about the work ahead of us, and I want to dive right into the questions, which will be followed by a quick closing. And so we really want to get folks involved. And so I am going to kick these questions out. Primarily, these questions are directed at our two new family members, Dr. Olivo and Lizana, but there may be areas by which our presidents and of course our chancellor may want to jump in, and certainly I want to leave that opportunity available. So with that being said, our first question, Dr. Olivo did respond to, but I wanted to open it up a little bit more and give certainly Lizana an opportunity to respond. Hiram Jackson, one of our employees here in Los Rios, has done a lot of work with our local K-12 systems and is really talking about the opportunities between our students that may be considered middle to upper class and have opportunities to take extracurricular activities when some other students don't. And so the question really is that it seems that standardized testing has been used as a tool for modern social segregation in our public schools. Lizana, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond, and then Dr. Olivo, if there's anything you'd like to add to your previous response, please feel free to do so.
Yes, first of all, before I answer that question, I want to give the appropriate shout outs to Chancellor King and to the 4 college presidents for being courageous and visionary enough to really engage the Los Rios community in this work. I want to say that before we conclude. Yes, standardized testing has played a role in standardized test has been one of many tools used in an anti-education for Latinx and African American students. The actual founders of the key standardized tests we use in this nation. Carl Terman created the SAT, and it was designed from a eugenics lens. And those who don't know what eugenics is, it's a pseudoscience that was used to rationalize the biological inferiority of people who were quote unquote Aryan. And so everything from the IQ test to the SAT to the Stanford Binet test, they all were created to create a data based rationale for racialized discrimination. And so that's why when I work with organizations, I don't just jump right into data because data means nothing without analysis. And we have to critique the lens under which we're analyzing data. And so a lot of data, and I'll deal with this when we start working with the schools. I'll have a whole thing on how we analyze data, but a lot of data is used to seem as an objective resource or objective source to rationalize how you treat certain people. So I'll just use the context of mass incarceration. If you looked at the numbers of people who are incarcerated in the United States of America, you would think that Latinx and African Americans were the biggest criminals the world had ever seen. But you realize that just looking at the numerical data does not tell you that, one, there's been a war on those communities. Two, that American justice system is a lot more favorable to a guilty rich person than an innocent poor person. And three, that these communities are over-policed and laws are written to criminalize the behaviors that they engage in, right? So if you look at things like Rockefeller laws, that if you use this particular type of substance, it's a harsher penalty than this, right? And so if you want more about that, you can watch the movie on Netflix called 13th. But I'm saying that to say is that if you just looked at data and tried to be objective, you say, oh, wow, this is the criminal class, not realizing that the data is the effect of the creation of a criminal class by a system that wants to disenfranchise particular communities. Because if you look at the Department of Justice overall system, people commit crimes and use recreational substances in the percentages that they make up of that community. So African Americans make about 14% of the American communities. We use about 14% of the drugs, but we're arrested 70% of the time. You understand what I'm saying? And I actually talked with a peace officer about this. I said, hey man, the Department of Justice says that a person who's classified as white is 5 times more likely to have narcotics in their car than a person who's black or Latinx. Why don't y'all pull over white people? He said, I'm gonna be honest with you that he said, white people tend to have their registration, tend to have their insurance. They tend to not drive cars that have broken taillights. So there's really no real rationale for us to initially pull them over. While poorer people, they may not be able to afford to fix their taillight, or their tags might be expired. So we actually have more of a reason to pull them over and then go to a further investigation versus other people who are protected. So I say all that to say this. Yes, the SAT, yes, the standardized test, but all of these data that we rely on to try to appear to be objective have to be interrogated with a particular lens. And that is in and of itself a skill set to understand the lens under which you're interrogating data.
Thank you, Lizana. Speaking of interrogation and examining and analysis, the next question I'm going to kick to you, Dr. Olivo, and this is related to the definition of student success, right? As we talk about systemic inequalities and the impacts that has on students, we've defined student success in A, B, or C kind of category that really lacks the cultural nuance, the history of people of color in higher education, and really ignores the Eurocentric definition of success. How do we reconcile this as educators as we proceed in this work?
Yes, thank you. I would say, we do have to figure out ways to affirm our students and the success that they experience along the way, right? And we also have to recognize that what we are seeking to do as a community in the Los Rios Community College District is to help our students complete their courses, help them to make progress towards achieving their degrees, and specifically focusing on the milestone that we see that is helpful towards students achieving their degree, and that's getting through college level math and English. So we're going to be really focused on those metrics And yes, we will also recognize how can we affirm our students and the successes they're achieving along the way. You're right, it's extremely important to recognize that. I've worked with Dr. Daniel Solorzano at UCLA, and he talks a lot about and researches the impact of microaggression on our students, right? And he says as educators, we have to figure out how to give our students micro affirmations. And we will explore that topic together as a community as well, so that you all can learn, how do we affirm our students and recognize that they are achieving success, as a part of earning those A's, B's, and C's. And that's what I would offer for our member that posed that question.
Thank you, Lizanna. I'd like to give you an opportunity. You're muted.
So read my lips. I really like that question because what we have to understand is that this student success era that we're in was not self-imposed, but the way in which we were asked to evaluate ourselves was self-imposed. And so what happened is that there had been a heavy critique on post-secondary education around the mid-1990s about, is this education working, right? Does college work? Because up until that point, as long as the Ivy Leagues produced the leaders of the Beltway, they really didn't critique it. But when Pell Grants and loans and all this other kind of funding, federal and state money, were coming to post-secondary education, particular political leaders started saying, well, does college work? And so they went to the colleges and says, how are y'all going to show us that college work? And the 4,500 some colleges and universities in the United States of America landed on these metrics. Admissions, right? Retention and persistence, and graduation. That's the metrics they landed on of student success. Who are we admitting, right? What does that admissions class look like? Are they staying past the first and second semester? And are they graduating, right? Now we've looked at things like course success. In community colleges, we look at transfer level English and math, but those are the metrics of student success. Those deserve to be critiqued, right? We need to critique that. Are these the true measures of quote unquote student success? Because these measures of student success don't necessarily measure what? Learning, right? And so it's a valid question, right? One that we need to simultaneously grapple with while we're meeting these contemporary measures of student success, but then begin to interrogate, why are we using these measures of success? But I want to clarify, that's why we're using these measures, because pressure we're putting on post-secondary institutions on, does schooling work? And this is what they landed on: admissions, retention, graduation. And that's how we landed here.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to our next question, which is really looking at, as we continue to investigate the outcomes in our classroom based on kind of racial divide, if you will, or cultural divide. What if we determine that there's no statistical difference? Then what? What do we do?
Well, I can share, what James Gray and his colleagues at the community college in Aurora did is when they found that there were faculty that had no disparities in students from the different racial backgrounds, then what we are called to do as educators is inquire into the practices that exist for that teacher in the classroom and figure out, is there something that teacher is doing? And so there is an equity classroom observation tool that is available so that you can do either a peer observation, the chair can do an observation. In any case, it's a matter of continuing that inquiry process to determine, what can we learn from an educator that has no disparities in racial outcomes, and then figure out, how do you learn from that, inform your own practice, change your practice, and as an institution, scale that practice. So I would say that's what I would recommend if we have no gaps in our racial outcomes.
Excellent. I'm going to take another question, and if I may be so forward, I'm going to take a stab at it a little bit and then kick it to you, Lizana and Dr. Olivo. There is a question just really related to the attitudes and tensions of our classroom instructors. And yes, that work needs to occur, but not disregarding or not acknowledging that the same needs to occur at students in the student services regard. And really, this question is about how do we get district campus leadership to really value the work that happens in student services is the first question of it. And then how do we provide the resources where necessary to ensure that the appropriate collaboration is happening in all areas of our colleges and across the district. And I think right now experiencing a little bit of frustration in that regard. So I want to kind of speak to a little bit of that. I think that the first thing is this effort that we're going into together collectively is going to occur at all levels. So our board is going to engage with Dr. Olivo and Lizana, our executive teams, our leadership teams. They have already been involved in a meeting with our academic senate. The same will be true with our classified senate. And so it's going to be at every level, our students. And this work is going to permeate our institution. And some of it will speak to, I think, the concern raised in this particular question about the focus on certain areas versus others. A real holistic approach is necessary in order for us to serve our students, but also serve one another well. So I just wanted to speak to that piece and ensure and kind of express the understanding that leadership has a role to play here. And certainly we are going to be leaning into this process, and student services is certainly a critical area to support. So with that, the question is really the focus on student services and how do we get the support of leadership from you all's perspective and experience to support collaboration across colleges and districts.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we engaged in this work with classified staff as well. Yes, we did focus on, our goal was to engage at least 50% of the full-time tenured faculty in this intentional professional development, learning the same vocabulary and framework. But then we also knew you can't just do this work for classroom instructors and then, not do the same work in the services. And you notice the community college success measure survey that I shared, there's a whole segment on the experiences students have in student services. And so you must inquire, how are students experiencing the front counters, the library, the tutoring centers? All of those experiences lend towards, is your college engaging in equity work that correlates to racial equity outcomes that we need or not? And so there will be absolutely professional development that Lizana and I provide to address student services. You're a critical part of the process.
And I want to get through one question with the acknowledgement that it's very college specific and may require some kind of back-end conversation. But as you both have discussed, the Center for Urban Education, as well as the work with Dr. Wood and Dr. Harris and many others, our colleges have been engaged in a lot of these activities and this work. Bringing them onto our campuses to work with our teams in particular, and also look at policies and practices that we have in play. In one particular area is in our HR, right? Some of our hiring practices and processes in order to not only diversify, but create an equitable process. And so with that being said, one of our colleges has engaged with CUE and has done some extensive work and are doing, continuing those efforts. And they feel like there's a need to kind of leveling up their work, right? To really kick up where they are and are interested in hearing about how they can change, take a more structural approach and include changes at the individual instructional level, also encompasses institutional factors such as policies, budget practices, hiring, retention, etc. So in many respects, this individual answered some of their own questions, but I would like you guys to chime in, and then from there we'll go into a closing. So give you maybe a minute apiece to respond to this, and certainly if we need to do follow-up, we can with this particular college. Lizana, would you like to start in response to this? And really just to restate, you got the question?
Yes, I do.
Excellent.
So, yeah, a lot of us are at different levels. It's like a spectrum, you know, where we are as organizations, and then places within organizations as far as this work. As far as leveling up, part of the responsibility that Cynthia and I have is to do some type of scaffolding and to work with various parts within organizations. And so it's not necessarily a situation of looking at what Q has done and quote unquote building on it. It's about really scaling the frameworks. And then also it's about impacting those areas where they don't see any value right at the beginning of having a conversation about race and identity, right? So organizations that I've worked with, and you go to the business office is like, why are we talking about this? We mostly just deal with salary, pay scale, spreadsheets, and things of that nature. But not understanding is that all those things happen in a context. And when we as organizations are in crises like we are now, where we have to make cuts and make decisions, are the people who are there with the spreadsheets having an equity-minded understanding in that we may be disproportionately impacting certain student groups when we eliminate certain programs or positions, or we're doing that with our colleagues that happen to work in certain areas that disproportionately represent groups. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to work with in those very challenging areas within our college campuses.
So thank you so much, Lizana, for that response. And we still have some questions, and I will do my due diligence in following up with those in collaboration with Dr. Olivo and Lizana. One of the things that I want to highlight in our closing is this is not the only session that we will have. We are partnering over this next academic year and likely beyond to continue this work and get to things such as policies and decision-making around hiring, which we've already tackled. I want to close by saying that, you know, a part of me was a little disheartened when I seen the number of participants today. But I think it also highlights the heavy nature of what we're grappling with right now, just with the pandemic and trying to adapt, and also the difficulty of these topics that we're going to have to lean into in the future. So those that have participated today, I want to thank you for taking the time out and investing the energy into becoming more knowledgeable about the direction that we're heading, but also hopefully reflecting on your role in it. I would also like to say that we are not absent of people that have skill sets in doing equity work, anti-racist work, and anti-sexism work. And so we will be leveraging the people within our district to help support this. And so I would ask that you encourage your peers, you encourage your colleagues to listen to this recording. I think you encourage dialogue that can be somewhat controversial, but certainly the conversations we need to have. I appreciate again your time. I can't thank our board, our leadership, and our college presidents enough, and all of you that participated today. So thank you for your time, Dr. Olivo and Lizana. We look forward to working with you over the year. And I want to thank Gabe and Jennifer for supporting kind of the technical aspects of this process. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us. And we look forward to this work that we have ahead and providing the professional development necessary to better support our students. Thank you so much. Have a great day.